Welcome back to Doing Diaspora. I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend and sparring partner for many years now, Liza Gashi. Liza is an executive leader, innovator, and entrepreneur with global experience in programs and multi-stakeholder engagement. She's experienced in policy, research, strategies, partnership development, and digital diplomacy. She is the founder of GERMIN, one of my favorite diaspora organizations around, which is a leading civil society organization that facilitates and strengthens linkages between diaspora citizens and governments, and has been recognized as an early mover example in determining on how diaspora networks function. And I echo that thought. She also co-founded KosovoDiaspora.org, a crowdsourcing digital engagement and diplomacy platform that connects Kosovars to the world and the world with Kosovars. Moreover, she's the founder and president of UWC Kosovo, the National Committee of Kosovo for United World Colleges, the global education movement that makes education a force to unite people, nations, and cultures for peace and a sustainable future. In the past, Liza has also worked for numerous think tanks and research institutes and centers all over the world. She has completed a Master's of Public Administration at Arizona State University and holds a bachelor's degree from Marquardt College in International Relations, Political Science, and Spanish Language. She is a graduate of the United World College in Costa Rica and alumni of an exchange program at the National University of Cordoba in Argentina. In the previous government of Albin Kurti, she was appointed a Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Diaspora. Liza, welcome. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Martin.
Yeah. No, it's good. We look, as we go through the conversation, we'll drop a few stories about how we first met and that ominous meeting of Pete's Coffee in Washington a few years ago where I thought you were going to give out to me, but we'll come to that in a moment. So look, the first question, Liza, is something that I ask everybody I talk to, and part of the reason why we do this is, what brought you to diaspora engagement, or what kind of inspired you to follow that path?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I think, when I think of what brought me to diaspora engagement, I don't think there's one piece of a topic. I think one is really Kosovo's history and a sense of belonging to home and understanding why people leave and why people come back. I grew up in an environment where I had uncles, cousins, and a lot of people sort of leaving, yet every summer they would come back. So as a kid, I was always intrigued by the fact that people were moving between places. And then within that, when I started moving and living in between places myself, I realized how important it is to have that sense of belonging and reconnecting with your roots and understanding where you are. But more important, that sense of belonging, because it was some sort of support mechanism along the process of my journey. And so that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, it's really people you meet in the journey, like folks like yourself, or my partner back in the days on building Kosovo Diaspora and GERMIN, Behar Jara, whom I happened to meet virtually in a group that was trying to stay connected and sort of finding ways to give back, but also to receive in terms of that sense of belonging. And so through that journey with Behar, I realized the importance of, this piece of a puzzle that we live it through it. We don't necessarily understand it until we leave on a different side of the world, or we are in a position where we have to figure out what to do with this social group that is crucial for the country, especially if you're living in a developing world, when you have a big chunk of community sort of moving into places, because today in 21st century, really, it's not a matter of you deciding where you live, it's where the market brings you. But at the same time, there's always that affinity of belonging and that identity layer that reconnects you. So to keep it is multiple things, including the chat we had at Pete's Coffee in DC, which I am forever thankful to Mark Cosmo for introducing. It's things like this that you realize, wow, there's been multiple things that really got me intrigued in the topic, and ultimately made me realize that there is so much power within the theme, although people often undermine it because they say, oh, it's too niche, too small, like what are you going to do with it? But I think there's so much to it once you get hooked to it, and then you realize, oh, there's much more.
Incredibly well said. Look, I think we're only scratching at the surface, and let's begin with that story about the infamous Mark Cosmo, and I'm sure people won't mind me sharing this that were involved. I remember giving a talk at Boston University, and it was about 6 months after we'd been involved in the policy in Albania. And the professor at university, just before I was going to give the talk, I was giving the talk on networking and philanthropy, and the professor pulled me aside, and she said, "There's 3 Albanians looking for you." So the next word out of my mouth was, you know, what time is the next flight to Dublin? Yeah, you know? So but Mark pulled me aside and he said he had 2 young people that I had to meet, and it was yourself and Behar,
Yeah.
and so a couple of days later we met in DC, and the rest is history, as they say. You know, and I think, you know, what was interesting, you know, from your own story, you know, when we talk about diaspora in your region, Lisa, to be frank, you know, Kosovo, Albania, and the wider region, you know, when people say diaspora, the next word out of the mouth tends to be Liza Gashi. You know, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I'll let you make that mind up. But, you know, I know your own story is much more global in that, and you spoke to that in terms of your answer to the first question. You know, where do you see yourself in the global landscape in the next couple of years? Because I know you're keen to build out that global portfolio. So, you know, this is the moment to tell people how to go global.
Yeah, no, I think so. Sort of my story is also I've been in between places, and sort of I left home when I was 16 to Costa Rica to go for a high school. You know, after the conflict in Kosovo, the first thing I was thinking is looking for better education abroad, but always thinking on reconnecting communities and making sure we build on this idea of sharing the wealth and resources for a better world. And so spent over a decade on different parts of Americas. So I think my big stops were Argentina, Costa Rica, and US, but also spent a couple of months and project work in different countries across the Americas. And in that process, I realized the power of creating communities where everyone could thrive, regardless of their background and identity, and making sure we bring together people, because experiences in one side of the globe could easily be replicated on the other part of the globe without really having that competition aspect. And to dive in, I think it fits very well with your best club of case, copy and steal everything that works in that process. And I felt like, okay, there's so much that I could do in Costa Rica that could be easily implemented in Kosovo, just in terms of context, or in Japan, as a matter of fact. So you had people from across the world who were moving. And then when we realized, when we sort of cherished the diversity aspect of it, we were always ahead or further. But then in that process, I think in addition to really realizing the power of diversity and upholding diversity to a standard in classrooms, in teams, in projects, in sharing ideas, it's also equally important to realize the important layer of your heritage. Who are you? What you're from? Where you're from? What you stand for? And how do you reconnect with your roots? Because often in this world of dominances, there's people and folks across different lives, and particularly folks who have a migration journey, that often feel afraid to speak up right away because they're being perceived as the other. And so in that journey, to me, it was very important to always reconnect with my roots, reconnect with my identity, and being really blunt and open about who I am, what I stand for, and how my journey has sort of built in me that resiliency. And I think that resiliency component goes along with many migrants who turn, to be successful or less successful. I don't know what the successful standard of today's world is, because for me it's being comfortable but being who you are ultimately, and then taking it to the next journey. So I think that's basically the part, but I want to get these pieces of the puzzle of my journey, particularly with what we've tested out in the region. You know, the Western Balkans have been a region of lots of conflict, lots of challenges, historical narratives, emotional baggages for different parts of the history. And so trying to overcome that to the next aspect of reconnecting with folks from different walks of life that have left and that are willing to return in short term, long term, to bring new energies and to bring new experiences. Because I think once you leave a certain place, you get exposed to something different, and that exposure turns into an experience. Like without seeing, it's very hard to do in turning things into doing. And so in that aspect, I feel like bringing this wealth of knowledge and skills and really practices that we've done in the region, I would like to take what we've done here to another level. Because like I said earlier, I believe that anything that you do that makes some sort of, brings a model that could be replicated, then we could really move forward. So I'm looking forward to get these cases in the region to other parts of the world, because there's much more to learn from one another.
Incredibly well said. And you know, when you talk about diaspora and conflict, just talk to the Irish. We've been there, so we feel your pain on that, you know. But I just want to take a moment to pause, because, you know, you're saying something that's incredibly important and touching for where the world is at the moment. You know, in the conversation so far, you've been exploring ideas of belonging, community, diversity, you know, experience. These are terminologies and realities that are actually at the core of solving some of the most pressing either political or social or economic or cultural issues that we face. You know, you just have to look across where the world is crumbling at the moment. It doesn't take too much of a hint to guess right where I'm talking about, you know. So that's what's interesting. And you know, the title of this is Doing Diaspora. So let's shift gear maybe a little bit, because I think that incredibly astute understanding of those issues show what you can bring to the world. But what really interests me, you know, when people ask me who are maybe the 3 to 4 diaspora organizations out there or entities that I think are, and these are nonprofits I'm talking about predominantly, that are capable of scale, one of the first out of my mouth is GERMIN. Right? And the reason why I say that is that you folks have, you built models of engagement, you know, and the beauty of your team is not just in the diversity of the team. And I know you've left now and you're in the next phase of your career. But one thing that always impressed me was the diversity of your team, the youthfulness of your team, and the courage of your team, but also the humility of your team. I don't think you realize how good you were, right? Which is probably the best compliment I could pay anybody. So you've built those strategies and systems of engagement. So my key question here is, you know, if you were sitting down with somebody that was beginning this process or maybe in the middle of the process and not maybe having a bit of impact or struggling, what would you see as the key factors for success in diaspora engagement?
I think the key part of it, really keeping consistency. Consistency is key in really delivering diaspora engagement. You will walk across people who will say you're crazy, this is not going to work. Somebody says, oh, I tried before, it's not going to work. The other person says, oh, you're a young girl, I'm trying to so hard, but this is not going to work. And so all these things out there are the pushing factors that are telling you this is not possible. But if you keep a consistency in the process and you are comfortable with progress over perfection, then you will reach to a point where the people that actually initially told you, hey, this is not possible, this is too much, then realize that, hey, something is going on. These people are still keep moving. So I think if there was one little piece of advice to give to anyone who is starting to do diaspora engagement, it's to keep it consistent and to be comfortable with all the unknowns in the field, and ultimately to be ready to face all this sort of negativity in, no, it's not possible, no, don't do it, and stuff like that.
You know what that's called, right? That's called jealousy.
Jealousy, but also it's just often people tried it and failed and they think, okay, others can't do it.
There's a famous old Irish saying that Kingsley told me many years ago about diaspora engagement that sums it up, and it says, you know, two neighbors living next to each other, one is struggling and one is successful, and the other one goes to buy the other neighbor's horse, you know, and the neighbor says to him, I prefer my horse dead than you have two.
There you go.
I think what's really interesting as well, you know, for where you're going forward, and this is something that's been lurking in the back of my mind, and what I love about what you have done, you know, particularly systematically in your diaspora engagement, is you've done the hard work of getting out there and talking with your communities abroad. You know, and what I've partially historically we've done this poorly, but I think during the pandemic it was a bit of a disappointment in myself as well and the wider sector that we went back to old habit of talking at diasporas. You know, we were talking about, we were telling them about how remittances are falling. We were telling them about how to invest back, how to do this, how to do that. You know, so do you have any insights, you know, about, you know, how you use that mechanism of talking with your diaspora rather than talking at them, you know, to build and overcome all those age-old issues of trust, you know, building that sense of community? Do you have any tips or ideas that people might be interested in on what that looks like?
I think, you know, going with the idea of learning is crucial, especially at the beginning, because often we might look at different studies, different sources, and then frame a model and then go into the communities thinking you have it all. And the reality is that diaspora engagement is all about listening in many aspects of it, but not just listening to the successful ones like we often talk about, Martin, but listening the most to the vulnerable ones, to the ones that have left, are trying to make a living in different parts of the world, yet caring about helping home, reconnecting with home, and to the ones that really are out there willing to engage, wanting to be heard, but there's never a space. So at first, not having that, like sort of having that, creating that environment where people could feel comfortable sharing, I think is crucial in that design aspect. And the second part, I think, is genuine listening, but not just listening for the sake of, you know, sort of a project, a tick of the box and move on, but really understanding their underlying thoughts of what it means to reconnect with the community they live in, what it means to adapt, because we often think, okay, all about diaspora is how can they help us? And that's where most governments sometimes get it wrong. They say, okay, this is a big chunk of money that comes from remittances. How do we tax this? And then the next thing is like, how do we make tourism bloom through them? But very little, they say, what can we help? How can we give back? And I think sort of the give back aspect, or sort of paying it forward, if you want them to stay engaged, if you want them truly to be part of the puzzle, it's important to include their voices, hear their thoughts, and most importantly, start applying concrete steps of what they ask, because in order to build this bridge of trust, there is a need for this two-way communication. And often we miss into that two-way approach where you go and listen to diaspora talks back, and you take actions. It's not like you just listen, and at the end of the day, there's nothing. That's when you lose the trust. But listening and
you listen and you do what you want to know. You know?
That's the tendency, but it doesn't work well.
we can change that slowly. Don't worry about that. Look, I think you're touching on something really important, and you know, this distinction between the vulnerable and the successful, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, what I found, you know, is that when you sit down with the people that have been successful in your diaspora, they will ask you at a certain point, what are you doing for the people that have been less successful than I am? You know, and ironically, putting them together is actually really interesting as well, because they get a sense of the reality, and that can help guide and inspire them to be a bit more active. You know, you mentioned design and listening. You know, and I buy into listening. You know that I train people on listening. I fundamentally believe networking and listening are the two key skills in diaspora engagement. But when you talk about design, let's take that a step further and say, you know, you've been around the sector now for quite a bit, and you've engaged with governments, you've engaged civil society, you've engaged private sector, international donors. You know, you've been on the front line of this. And if I was to ask you, you know, we're after a listening exercise thematically, because a lot of people listening to this mightn't have the capacity to go out and listen and do all that kind of stuff, and they might be saying, you know, Liza, where would you recommend 1 to 2 key areas of diaspora engagement that we should focus on, or that you think are most important? Because diaspora engagement is a big term, right? So the question is basically, you know, which areas do you really see, you know, solid work being done in, and something that can get people a bit of success along the way?
So there's like you said, it's often when you tell people about, oh, you do diaspora work, they say, what's that, right? At first it's getting the term sort of clear to them, and then the next stage is bringing together migration and diaspora, right? So people understand very well the migration and the negativity that comes with it in today's world, but very little do they understand diaspora and the power of it to really shift the narrative, and as well bring that sort of hopefulness picture in terms, like I see diaspora as a two sort of phase model, right? You have often in certain regions, particularly in developing world, hopeless youth based on what has happened to the country, how they see their day-to-day life, how they perceive bigger markets. In that aspect, you have them wishing to join the diaspora community, and then the other hand, you have diaspora community who they view their countries as a land of opportunity, because when you are in a big market, sometimes you don't get always that support mechanism. That belonging aspect then becomes an important part of the journey. So I see a lot of good strategies on youth in terms of reconnecting youth to really address some of the sustainable development goals of 2030. In that aspect, sort of bringing that co-creation process, always keeping in mind that human-centered design aspect of it, because young people today, particularly millennials, are looking more into things that make their life meaningful. And in that journey of sort of reconnecting, but also meeting the unknown and meeting strangers across the process brings so much to life, and so much to our today's reality, despite the fact that the pandemic has kind of put a pause on the global world and made you realize, okay, who are you matters, because you are on between four corners, and how you cherish life, how you drive progress forward for yourself, for your community. It's crucial for that ecosystem to exist in the future. So in terms of really focus, I think, because older generations are connected by default, right? There's much more emotion to it. There is much more patriotism into the topic, versus young generations who are born and raised somewhere else, just happen to be kids of Albanian parents or kids of Irish parents. They grew up in completely different reality, and on this household with very much a mix of background, and so they're trying to navigate through that process. And so it's so important for them to get exposed, to know, and they're also very curious. So you build on the curiosity to really offer unique aspects of their heritage. And there's multiple programs that have been done out there, and we've developed one of our own. It's called Diaspora School, where we bring folks from the region and the world to co-create together in the process of addressing really local problems. And the idea of also addressing sometimes local problem is that we often get into the idea that only locals can address local problems. And the truth is that sometimes outsiders, when they bring a fresh perspective into a topic of locals, it actually could make a big difference. Or outsiders could also bring a practice, a success story, and it allows for that transfer of knowledge. It allows for rethinking a bit the problem, but also it brings so much to that end goal of providing a solution to a problem. Because often we get stuck in the journey and we are constantly struggling on, okay, what to do. But so I think youth, to go back to your question, is one aspect of it, and this connects with next generation, with heritage aspect of this young population. The other part is with this, it's also, entrepreneurship and innovation are the buzzy words of the world, but how do we bring people about to make, to be innovative on what they do and to truly enjoy that process? I think often I take examples of folks who were born and raised in Switzerland, but in such a big market, their idea was very hard to kick off. But in developing world, that idea could actually kick off faster, because developing world is eager and looking for new opportunities and new business ideas and new injection. So coming from a developed country to a developing world country to plug in an idea, you often undermine the power of impact, but that impact also could be faster shown in a small market rather than big one. And so that, I think, also has a potential to be a strategy where, countries across the world that are looking to reconnect with their diasporas could build in sort of pilot projects on engaging young entrepreneurs, engaging young investors in their country to really bring the fresh perspective, but also bring capital along the journey. And you will see quickly things could start developing way faster because there's not much happening. So when something new comes in and people start seeing that as a center, then you become sort of a key driver of an ecosystem that is struggling to be built.
Incredibly well said, you know, and I think you mentioned the word hopeful. I mean, that's a very optimistic viewpoint, so and timely. And I loved your phrase. I remember the first time we properly sat down in a formal setting. It was in the mountains in Kosovo, I believe, and we had a bit of a retreat. And you uttered this phrase, co-creation. You know, and I think it's a very powerful way of framing diaspora engagement. So in the true spirit of copy and steal everything, you will see that popping up in my presentations more and more over the next few years. You know, I think you're hitting on something. You have your finger on your pulse. That is something incredibly powerful, and that is in the next generation. And in diaspora engagement, you know, youth often get silenced. You know, and it's part of the reason why we actually wanted to do this series. You know, the average age of speaker hopefully will be 30 and under. You know, in terms of getting a voice out there and pushing people on in that sense. You know, you've spoken about, and I know you've done incredible work as well around kind of advocating for diaspora rights. You've spoken about youth, you know, you've spoken about knowledge exchange, you know, bringing back skills, both capital, whether it's remittances or social remittances, in terms of their ideas and practices. You know, looking at the sector more broadly now, do you see any particular areas? You mentioned entrepreneurship and innovation, so that might be the answer, and if it is, feel free to say so. But do you see any areas that are particularly primed for really building on in terms of the longevity of diaspora engagement? So, you know, do you see legs in things such as public-private partnership, you know, co-creation of capital funds, you know, what's in your head there in the sense of what you see as ready for scale?
You know, Martin, we've built the model on local investment, for example, and that journey of understanding how local investment works with diaspora and co-creation process made me realize of the huge potential that there is in private sector for diaspora in terms of, you know, diasporas are often dual citizens and well connected economically and politically in the country where they reside, and understanding the power of this crucial interlinkage role that they play could be a game changer for particularly smaller countries, like from the aspect of trade access to facilitation to really being serving as entry point for different markets, facilitators, importers, or even distributors for the products. It's important to tackle that aspect of global market. Like I said, pandemic has put a pause in some of the things, but certainly this will be the future of re-engaging. So like either through co-creation with public-private partnerships, local, particularly local, you know, in a sense, smaller cities, like, because when we tend to talk about diaspora, we talk about you know, sort of the countrywide aspect of it, but often we undermine the power of the street where this person lived, the city, what connects them to that particular, you know, what is the choice. In addition to really having an emotional aspect, it also has to make sense business-wise, because often people think, oh, just because diasporas are emotionally connected, they're going to change the world. The truth is that it has to make business sense. If you're into doing business, you know, ultimately where you come from and how the city connects you emotionally, it's important. And in today's world where big decisions are being made about where your next outsourcing destination will be, having that connection is very important. But in addition to it, I think often there has to be homework done from the receiving countries. So I see a huge potential on PPPs. I see a big potential on co-investment, but also particularly in countries where high unemployment of youth is an issue. So in order to create, you know, the next generation of jobs, I feel diaspora plays a role. If you look particularly in the cases in the region, you have like heavily countries in the region depend on remittances. We're talking 15 to 17%, which is big for the share of GDP. And so if you were to rethink that remittances, rather than sending money to your cousins to keep so the next month, it's investing in a business so that cousin can become independent and could then pay it forward and support the next generation. So I see that as a potential, but I also see lots of areas where diaspora could deepen their connection with their home countries in terms of, you know, sectors such as healthcare, for example. Particularly now, you have a huge opportunity, you know, across, let's say, Africa, healthcare, manufacturing, infrastructure, and many other areas where diaspora that has come to a level of success wherever they reside, to reinvest that money on somewhere where then, you know, the next, where there is a need, but there is also huge potential. And ultimately it's cost effectiveness that also makes a difference. And in addition to those two sectors, I see a huge also potential in philanthropy, partly because I see the willingness to give and to pay it forward, but more importantly to really impact societies at not just curing the symptoms of the problems, but going into the root causes. And I think that power is there and has been shown. And we have recent examples of, for example, Lebanon crisis with Explosion, where we had, you know, organizations such as Impact Lebanon that fundraised over 5 million in matter of 24 hours, and with others. So in the past, it was always the sort of the strong arm was in international donors, in big agencies, but now people are looking into people as well, and people are more willing to give. And this crowdsourcing aspect of it has also made people feel like they can give at any amount without, you know, feeling like, oh, it's too little, what my $1 can do. So that there's that power to crowdsourcing and philanthropy to really reshape a bit the
completely,
you know, different aspects.
Completely agree with that. And the beauty of that, Lisa, is that they're all interconnected. You know, look, you know my own background in terms of studying and being one of the strongest voices of advocacy for diaspora philanthropy out there. You know, I think we need to do so much more of it. Where I see, you know, just a huge potential impact for diaspora philanthropists out there is to be investing in the exemplar nonprofits like yourselves, you know, and what you have planned. We'll come to what you're planning in the future in a moment, you know, to give you that independence and be that developer of development, you know, where you don't have to be filling out the what's the best diplomatic word for this? The tedious application forms.
Application is one part, reporting.
Yeah. You know, and I think that's the beauty of it. So look, incredibly well said. And you mentioned something, you know, about diaspora being about maybe place. You know, and I'm incredibly proud to be involved with a great Irish nonprofit called Ireland Reaching Out, which is essentially about that, you know, exploring that kind of genealogical trace back to a place. And that has all types of implications and knock-on for local economy and job creation. And so I think you're touching on something really important. And so you've given us a beautiful kind of panorama view, if that's the right word, in terms of what can be done. Now I want to insert a word that usually means trouble, if you're up for it. And you know, I mentioned in your introduction that, you know, you've done a lot of work in diplomacy, and there's particularly given, as you mentioned, with COVID, and when you mentioned where the world is going in the future, there's been a very subtle shift and realization of the importance of diaspora diplomacy and where it's going. So rather than kind of getting into a heated debate about diplomacy, let's bring in that word that usually causes trouble, which is government. and what is the role of government? Because you've had a unique opportunity, you know, of working in and across all those layers, you know, from the NGO side, from the government side, from, you know, the fundraising side and everything. So role of government and nonprofits, let's treat them equally together. What needs to be done to support them?
I think in many ways, it's kind of sad when you think in 21st century that communication is a big aspect of it. It's talk, but communicate on what you want to do and how you want to do. So like being able to reach out and being able to form these partnerships through communication. I think often government undermines the power of partnership across the spectrum, especially in a developing world, which, you know, tend to be the area where the most receives the help from diaspora. it's that part, that piece of the puzzle in terms of building partnership. I think you know, the Irish have a great way and a strategy of showing the world that, hey, partnership actually works, and you don't have to do it all as a government, because often there is a tendency in governments that they want to, and I understand the authority piece of it, but trying to reach something that is across the spectrum with one side thinking, it's a no-go. But we have so many practices of this no-go. We put so much effort and you know, experience and resources into it, and yet we don't always get the outcomes we want. So I think communication piece is crucial for government and civil society, but also the private sector. Sort of this understanding what are the needs and understanding what is that we want to give to diaspora, what is that we want to provide, be it services, be it you know, sort of reconnection tools, or information. In addition to this information, is being also ready to advocate for your diaspora, being ready to interconnect and to use your, you know, bilateral diplomacy aspect for your community to get there, to understand that the power of this, the communities out there, it's huge, especially if you're you know, if people from your country are first or second minority in the country that you're trying to approach. That plays a huge role in today's world. And so communication is one aspect of it. Doing well, and maybe, you know, you guys could help a lot in this aspect, and you've done tremendous work with governments across the world, but teaching government how to network with civil society, because often there is this attitude, us versus them. And it just doesn't take us anywhere, none of the sides in a way, but teaching them how to network and how to overcome that authority position. It's okay, I'm completely fine to have people drive the agenda, but to understand that a big puzzle needs different pieces.
That's it.
And we cannot just do it one way or another. So in that aspect, we need to do a lot more on bringing multiple stakeholders together, but not just for the sake of bringing them on one table. It's really paying attention to what we just talked earlier about listening, the power of listening, and the empathy towards the work people do. It's crucial to get us to the next stage. Well, and in that aspect, we have to do a lot more from both ends.
Well, here's the really interesting little problem maybe for government at the moment. And this is more in the context of international development and developing countries. You know, for quite a lot of time, the great agency of international development finance was public monies. And that's no longer the case. Yeah. You know, so what's really interesting for a lot of the great institutions out there, and they are great institutions and have great people working for them that have traditionally led the international development agenda, you know, they have to realign to a new little bit of an order here and a system. And the big dog in the house at the moment is the private sector, and they're waking up to it. You know, and that's really interesting. And you see that application back into the philanthropic landscape, you know, with private wealth setting up just really large scale foundations. And there are pros and cons for that. You know, that's not all a good news story. There's pros and cons to that. So I think you're touching on something that, when you talk about helping them to network with civil society, it's not an option anymore, it's a necessity. You know, because, you know, there's organizations out there now with reach and capacity, not just financially, but, you know, in terms of their own internal reach and ecosystems that can do a lot of good for countries all over the world, you know. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to keep an eye on, you know. If we sit down here in 10 years' time and we ask that question about the role of government, we might be having a fundamentally different question or different conversation. Look, I'm really conscious of your time, and I don't want to take too much of it. So a question that we normally like to kind of close on is to ask people to look into their crystal ball. You know, and I know that you have some exciting plans ahead for your own future. And for the listeners that are tuning in, stay tuned as well, because there'll be exciting news in terms of the Networking Institute and Liza Gashi coming out very soon. So we'll leave it at that for a moment. But, you know, crystal ball, in terms of diaspora engagement for you, you know, where do you see it in 5 years? Most importantly, where do you see yourself in 5 years as well? You know, and that could be diaspora or non-diaspora related in terms of where you're going. I'd just love to get your sense on that, because, as I say, you've got your hands dirty on the front line, so you might have a better read than
good
most.
Thing or bad thing?
That's a good thing. It's a good thing. We need more Liza Gashis in the world. So I'd love to get your impression of 5 years time diaspora engagement, 5 years time Liza Gashi.
Well, when I think on the retrospect, then I think 10 years ago when I talked about diaspora, people were like just staring and looking. And now, 10 years after, I see people actually saying, oh, what you talked about is actually very important because it combines with this idea of really building the social trust, but also taking the society to the next step. So I think in 5 years time, where I see diaspora, it's building and renewed this trust relationship between government, citizens, private sector. So this trio has to sort of sit and have an honest sort of strategy about how we move forward and how do we approach the unknown in many cases, because I think we can have all the plans in the world and boom, a pandemic happens and makes you realize that a lot of tools and mechanisms are not there, and we have to constantly reinvent ourselves. But also in this reinvention process, I think it's very crucial to understand that you don't always have to find that one Google question that no one asked, right? You sometimes have to just go and see what others have done. And that's why, you know, in the case of Irish or Israel or India, like the Triple E's, but we also have up and coming Jamaica, for example. We have Armenia doing different stuff. So there's peace and puzzle, or even Denmark recently with them trying to reach the Danes abroad. And you see folks in my region trying to figure out, okay, what's the future of Western Balkans, and what's the future of even, you know, I see a lot of work that has been done in Latin America with entrepreneurship through new exciting ways of building stuff. So I see the future precisely on that little phrase of co-creation that holds a lot of power, because it brings the known and unknown together to realistically reshape the future. And I know these are all big concepts, and it's sort of, okay, but what do you mean by reshaping the future? And what do you mean by, you know, not reinventing things? It's really, to me, it's crucial to keep three things in mind. It's looking, if you're looking for engaging your diaspora, are you asking for their time? If you're looking to engage them for their time, then what is it? What are the programs and the mechanisms you put in place to really use their time wisely for the development aspect? If you're looking for their talent, what type of skills you need in the market? So whether you want to restructure higher education, you want to reshape a bit your economy, and, you know, especially now that you have an opportune moment to, you know, see the gaps in between. So whether you're looking for that talent, what type of talent you're looking, and identifying that. And ultimately, if you're looking for that treasure, you know, in what ways are you looking for the treasure? Are you looking for people to just pay it forward and give to programs, whether it's philanthropical giving? Are you looking for people to invest in a big factory? Or are you looking for people to really co-invest on a small startup? Or are you looking for them to bring capital, and then you can figure out the rest? So this time, talent, and treasure is my triple aspect that needs to be defined in the next 5 years. And it has, there's way too many initiatives out there that you've exposed me to, and we've met, because I guess, you know, the beauty of also diaspora, doing diaspora, is that you get to know the folks who do stuff well, and who you need to copy them right away and say, what you've done with Ethiopian, exactly, what you've done with Ethiopian fund could be easily translated to Jamaica, to Kosovo, to see a rise in the topic. I see very important, you know, in the past we've always talked about how governments are picking up on diaspora, but it was mainly doing strategies, getting the policies ahead. But now I see government actually saying A, B, C. What are the policies of re-engaging them? Because once people, I had always kind of, it's sad, but in the past I dreamed about not having people coming to Kosovo during the summer, because I thought that's the only way to make people, to make policymakers understand the power of diaspora. And boom, pandemic happened, and I'm like, no, I don't know if my wish was a good one. Because I see the challenge that it brings to the economy, but I think it's also an opportune moment to really reflect and understand the power of this particular social group in the context, not just for your own country, but also in the context of adapting to a new country, because we often undermine their journey. And I think it's perfect moment to reimagine our communities and really cherishing the diversity and the background that comes with it.
Incredibly well said. Now the most important part of the question, where are you going to be?
I am looking forward to work with you guys at the Networking Institute. I'm looking forward to bring some of the knowledge and skills and practices in the region to expose to other parts of the world. I'm a big believer that the planet, it's as one, and this globalization aspect of it is crucial to understand the similarities beyond the differences. And so I feel like there's a lot of similarities in the patterns of why people leave, how they engage, why they engage. And so I believe that it's about time I step out to do more of outside for the world. I've spent a decade in the region on building stuff here. And, you know, often people will say, oh, especially government officials will say, oh, come on, Liza, give us a break. We're trying so hard. But, now they realize that, what I said and what I criticized was, important. So now we're moving on. So I'm looking forward to opportunities to scale the models we've done in the region, but also to learn from new models out there, to co-create with other diasporas, not just the Albanian one, but the Irish, the Indian, the Jamaican, to share practices. Especially would love to see a network of diaspora folks, because like I said, we're that little niche that everyone says, oh, but you're so small, to show that power of it as well.
Look, incredibly well said, and from our end, if there's anything we can do, and we will be working together, don't worry about that. And I hope the world is ready for you, and most importantly, never be afraid of big ideas, So Liza, I always ask people, is there anything that you would like to discuss that we haven't? I want to make sure that you're covered everything. I haven't caused any harm or insult.
There's conversation keeps going with you. So I have millions of other things that I want to discuss, but we have to be cautious of time, and also people who are tuning in and listening. We're always here. Look,
there's a simple fix to that. We can do another one. And. Look, how can people reach out to you? How can people get in touch?
I think LinkedIn is the best way. This will be posted on LinkedIn, and so Liza Gashi. It's not hard. I'm not hiding. That's the best part. I might hide in a few years' time, but as of now, I'm out there and trying to meet this. I think there's to close it in many ways. There's this African proverb that I'm big fan of, that strangers are just the friends you haven't met. So don't be afraid to reach out, to drop a note, to say, to hear more stuff about what we do, but also to find ways to collaborate and do stuff together.
Look, Liza, first of all, and finally, thank you for your time. And I'll finish with this story because I think it's an important story that people know. Mark Cosmo would very rarely hear me say thank you to him, but I want to say thank you to Mark for making that connection. And over the last couple of years, on and off, I've had the pleasure of mentoring Liza. And, what I want to say publicly, I hope people listen to this at the end. I'm incredibly proud of you. What you've done with the organization, where you're going in your own personal and professional career. And I think people will have realized over the last 30 to 40 minutes is that in that mentoring journey, I learned a hell of a lot more than you did from me. so I want to say thank you for that. And, genuinely to folks listening, Liza is one of the rising stars on this topic. Exciting days ahead. And, with the patience and a bit of luck, when we sit down in 5 years' time, I think everything that you just outlined will be well within reach. So, Liza, thank you. Keep in touch.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for your time, for your mentorship, and for always being there, not just for me, but for many others. To really
No, you're good, buddy. You're good, buddy. So it's important that this stuff works.
Sure.
Have a good day. Thanks, buddy.
Bye-bye.